So in this first segment of our introduction to global missions, I kind of wanted to start with, I'm not going to go to the book of Job, let's go to Jobs, like in Steve Jobs. I read his biography not long ago, and I was really fascinated by the aspect that in 1983, Steve Jobs was trying to figure out how to have Apple go to the next level. And he began recruiting a guy named John Sculley. Now, he was a famous businessman, and he was actually the CEO of Pepsi at that time. This is 1983. And ultimately, Steve Jobs got John Sculley to leave one of the plum, CEO jobs in America and become the head of Apple, of which he actually then took Apple from an $800 million company to an $8 billion company. Steve Jobs recruited John Sculley basically with these words. Here was kind of the line that really stood out to me in the book when I was reading about this. Steve Jobs said to John Sculley, 1983, he said, I remember this guy's the head of PepsiCo. He said, do you want to sell sugar water all of your life? Or do you want to help change the world? Wow. Do you want to sell sugar water all of your life? Or you want to help change the world? And that seemed to be something that really, impacted Mr. Sculley, and he came over to Apple for 10 years. I've been thinking about that in relation to my own life. I remember growing up as you, like we all do, trying to figure out what do I do, where do I go, what's worth living and dying for. In my particular time period, God had blessed me with some athletic abilities, and I was involved in sports, and I did pretty good in school too. In fact, I kind of cheated at study hall and became co-valedictorian in my high school class. And but as a part of being kind of an athlete scholar, a lot of people said, well, he's going to go on to be a doctor or a lawyer or this or that. My father's a doctor. But to be honest, after graduating from high school, I didn't have the foggiest idea what I was going to do. And that, probably most kids are that way. We're all that way, right? You have certain aspirations, talents, dreams, this, that. But I remember going away to college and thinking to myself, now there's all kinds of decisions I could make, but what is really worth living and dying for? And I had just become a Christian in my teenage years, and what really began to impact me was this aspect of, I really do want to make my life count. I want to give myself to something with a far bigger purpose than, for example, for me, just making money or just even being satisfied in a few things I was doing. And I wanted to help change the world too. But not only that, as a Christian, my heart desire was not only to help truly change the world. Now, of course, when Steve Jobs said those words, Steve Jobs basically meant, well, let's create products that'll help entertain people that the world's never seen before. That's what he meant by changing the world. And that's not a bad thing. It's a great thing. He was a phenomenal entrepreneur. But I don't think he changed too many lives internally. I don't think he did much, spiritual blessing in people's lives. And to put it another way, he certainly did not make any impact on eternity. In fact, his book is a very sad book because I don't even know where he is in eternity. He actually lived a very, very sad life. So he created the world's biggest business. He had a burden to change the world, but he only did it through entertainment. So during that same time period, he and I are about the same age, I was also seeking for what I could do. And that search led me to step away from university just after 1 year and actually fly around the world to a country I'd never been to before called New Zealand. And it was while I was there in 1972 that God really got a hold of my life, and I fell in love with the fact that the greatest cause in all the world was God's mission. That God had a plan for the globe, and it went back thousands and thousands of years. And there were so many different ways to be a part of it. It wasn't just one little piece a person could do, all kinds of ways people could be involved, that I needed to find my place in that. In fact, I came down to the conclusion that Psalm 139, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made, that God had made me for a reason. And so it wasn't about just making money or just having a family or just, whoever gets the most toys wins. It wasn't about that. It was about a bigger purpose of God trying to change, and actually not only a world, but change a universe, in terms of the eternal aspects of it. And it was while I was in New Zealand that I just all of a sudden became acquainted with this whole thing of global missions. The fact that God has had a plan for the planet and for the people of the planet. And not only do I need to understand that plan, but then, of course, just find my place in it. Now, I'll even say my little place in it. We all have little places in it. There's no big shots in God's kingdom. We just all have our little roles to play, and we play them. and if we're faithful, there's nothing better than that. Finding your niche in the only real game in town, which is God's purposes in changing the world. Because I'll say it simply this way, and you can even write this down. The goal of history is missions. That's the goal. The goal is salvation of the planet. And we need to see everything through those eyes. Even the rise and fall of empires and the development of history, which we're going to go through in different ways, it all comes back to that. The goal of history is missions. It has been from the very beginning. God trying to find a way to rescue, to redeem, to save the world. And to fall in love with that and to make that the reason you live, even though we all have to put food on the table and do all kinds of practical things to survive, but to find your place within that so that is the most wonderful thing we could ever do. And of course, from a New Testament standpoint, which we'll get to a little bit later, it boils down to this phrase, it's found in the Great Commission, which is Matthew 28, 18 to 20. And it was in New Zealand when I first began to understand this was what history was all about. It was the fulfillment of Christ's Great Commission in Matthew 28, 18 to 20. And here are those words. Jesus came to his disciples and he said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." And that's pretty incredible, right? It's one thing for Steve Jobs to say, "Hey, I'm the CEO of Apple. I have that authority. Come work with me." Here's Jesus Christ saying, "All authority has been given to me, in heaven and on earth." So, he's the one who owns it all, paid for it all authority given to him. His words then were, "Therefore, go." We're going to talk about that phrase in a number of contexts tonight. "Make disciples of all nations." That's the plan. "Baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." So we have go, make disciples, baptize them. In other words, identify them with me, which is what baptism is. And then teach them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. That's the promising thing. I've got on thousands of airplanes in my lifetime as I've traveled around to about 60 different nations, and I'm actually really glad that Jesus said he would be with us, no matter where we go. So it was a number of years ago, I said to myself, okay, if the ball game is all about God saving a world and providing a means of salvation and a family he wants in heaven and the impact on eternity, then Lord, what do you want me to do to be a part of that? How do you want me to go? To make disciples, to baptize, to teach. And thanks, you're going to be with me always, even to the end of the age. Let me just finish this with just a couple quotes I kind of want to give to you, just to kind of set the stage for a number of things we're going to talk about. Today is really going to be our 30,000-foot view of things. I'm going to kind of give the big overarching what it's all about today. But here's a couple of quotes just to begin this. The first one is by a guy named Dave Davidson. He's a missionary. He says, "World missions was on God's mind from the beginning." We don't tend to remember that. And here's another interesting one from a guy named Stephen Neal, a missiologist. He says, "Christian missionary work is the most difficult thing in the world. It's surprising that it ever should have been attempted." I don't know if you ever thought about that, but the aspect of actually invading another culture where there are fallen people, in that sense, rebellious people, and sometimes, though it's very loving, you're still being confrontational with other things. Bringing a confrontational message into the fact that you need to change. That's the hardest thing ever attempted. And of course, one of the greatest things ever done. Now here's a longer quote, but it's got some really neat things in it by a pretty famous author named John Piper. Some of you have heard of him, John Piper. John Piper says, God is pursuing with omnipotent passion a worldwide purpose of gathering joyful worshipers for himself from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. He has an inexhaustible enthusiasm for the supremacy of his name among the nations. Therefore, let us bring our affections into line with his, and for the sake of his name, let us renounce the quest for worldly comforts and join his global purpose. Pretty cool quote. God's all about raising up worshipers who come to know him. He has inexhaustible enthusiasm for his glory in the nations. So let's kind of lay aside the stuff that doesn't matter so much, and let's join in that global purpose. That doesn't mean we all become full-time missionaries. It does mean we all have his burden and find our place in his mission. We live missional lives. And that's my heart for you. That's the life that truly has meaning, temporal impact, and eternal impact.